Help TVO keep going. During the December donation drive, every donation made by December 31st is matched up to a total of $150,000. Your support helps provide learning resources, in-depth journalism, award-winning documentaries, and fun educational kids programming. Make a gift of $100 or more to receive a TVO tote bag. And please consider donating online to avoid mail delays and ensure you receive your charitable tax receipt for this year. Visit tvo.me/end-of-year to make a difference today.
You are listening.
You're listening.
You are listening.
You're listening
To a TVO Today.
To a TVO Today.
TVO Today. TVO Today
Podcast.
The following episode is about alleged homophobia and transphobia. Please listen with care.
Let's just, I'm going to quickly shoot Matt a text.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 police in front of Queen's Park and 1 over.
For most of this series, Matt and I have been covering events with a pretty lean team. It's usually just the two of us. But for this year's 1 Million March, we came with a bigger group.
And there was a huge crew at the back as well, yeah. Okay.
Based on last year's showing, we were expecting big crowds.
The topic of gender identity, once again the center of a protest here in the GTA.
As culture wars played out live on Metro Vancouver streets, things got heated and downright ugly.
Police did their best to keep the two groups separated, though tensions boiled over in Vancouver. In Ottawa, police arrested 2 people for inciting hatred and another for causing a disturbance.
Demonstrators on one side called it an education over indoctrination protest, while counter-protesters said that their rally was called Enough is Enough, there's no space for hate.
The turnout was very different in 2024. Across the country, news organizations reported on small, thin, and tiny crowds. And that appeared to be the case in Toronto, too. Notably, smaller crowds gathered this year in front of the Ontario Legislative Building at Queen's Park.
The 1 Million March has a problem with public education. The march's goal, as stated on their website, is to safeguard children from gender ideology teachings, sexual indoctrination, and exposure to explicit sexual content, ensuring that parental consent remains paramount. The 1 Million March first gathered in 2023.
Campaign Life Coalition, or CLC, is a far-right Christian pro-life and pro-family organization in Canada. We did a deep dive on them in episode 2. CLC promoted the 1 Million March this year and last year. According to the CLC's website, showing up to the 1 Million March was an act of Christian solidarity with the Muslim parents who were organizing the event.
The 1 Million March for Children is organized by a group called Hands Off Our Kids. But not everyone was there that day in support of the 1 Million March. Counter-protesters were also there in support of queer and trans rights.
It's kind of a small showing. It looks like there's maybe 20 people standing over there, maybe 25, and that seems to be the trans rights contingent that's here today.
Counter-protester signs didn't mince words.
It's a big pink canvas stretched between 2 big poles that says trans liberation now. There's another giant sign with the pink cursive that says F off.
But then the 1 Million March attendees started to pack up their things and leave.
They're saying goodbye to them as they pack up.
Where are they going to
go? Should we go ask them?
So far in the series, we've looked at what school boards, teachers, and determined organizers have had to say about queer and trans inclusion at publicly funded schools.
But what about parental rights advocates? What exactly is their position on queer and trans inclusion in publicly funded schools? And what about the rights of children? How does that play into the conversation? These were the questions that brought us to the 2024 1 Million March for Children. I'm Matt Nethersole.
And I'm Tiff Lam.
And this is the last episode of Queries, Episode 4, No Hate Here.
The kind of momentum and hate they were trying to spill last year seems to have dissipated, let's hope.
That's Fred Hahn. He's the president of CUPE Ontario, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. CUPE Ontario represents people working in public services in the province, like health, education, and emergency social and library services.
We have lots of trans folks who are members of our union, but we also have many of our members whose kids are trans kids. This is intimately connected to the work of our union.
Different counter-protesters against the 1 Million March declined to speak with us on the record that day. One of them directed us to Fred as their spokesperson.
People may frame this issue and understand it to be, why are you trying to remove the role of parents from children's lives? How would you respond to that understanding of this issue?
I think that it's a frame that's meant to play on people's fear. All of us are raised by our communities in some level. That's what public schools do. It's what childcare centers do. It's what faith groups do. We're raised in collective ways in our communities, and people don't want to acknowledge that reality. It's got nothing to do with diminishing the role of parents.
I take Fred's point here. His position is that it's not like parents' roles are diminished because other things outside the home are shaping kids as well.
Right. He's saying influence is not a zero-sum game. One side winning doesn't mean the other side has to lose. And Fred was out at Queen's Park to make that point again this year. Fred says he attended the inaugural 1 Million March in Ottawa in 2023 with his union as a counter-protester.
It was very intense. And for a number of the folks who are leaders of our union who had never experienced that kind of a demonstration, it was a bit traumatic, I think. But for those of us from queer and trans communities, we know what this is like. We can stand up and resist the hate that these folks are trying to spew in our communities.
But Fred still seemed empathetic towards organizers of the 1 Million March.
You know, the other side was, there's a lot of anger, and it's misplaced anger. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. It's unfortunate.
Where do you think that anger comes from on the other side of this argument?
I think that anger comes from a bunch of different places. People feel economically insecure. People feel like they have no control. And many of us don't really have control. And that frustration, that fear can be played upon by the right wing. Anyone who studies history knows that's what exactly has happened in the past. And we're experiencing the right wing trying to do it again today.
Parents have always been and will always be the real government, especially for their children.
Shortly after speaking with Fred Hahn, we made our way to the north end of Queen's Park. There, the 1 Million March had turned a war memorial into a makeshift stage. Police formed a perimeter around the bottom of the memorial steps, and a key organizer of the Million March, Kareem Tadros, addressed the crowd, flanked by 2 large speakers.
We remind the educational institutions and systems that schools were built to service the communities in which they stand.
Counter-protesters with speakers of their own try to drown out Kareem's speech with heavy metal and harmonica.
We entrusted them with that which we hold most precious, and they squandered it and mistreated the trust that we gave them with our children.
That day, 1 Million March speeches really emphasized empowering parents to understand what their rights are.
You have rights to demand the standard of education. You have rights to ask for exemptions that don't align with your family values.
After Kareem's opening remarks, a Pickering City Councillor, Lisa Robinson, makes an appearance.
And thank you very much, Ian, for the supporters of the LGBTQ+ community.
Lisa Robinson, like Kareem, emphasized that parents have the right to remove their children from ministry health and phys ed courses that cover topics like gender identity and sexual health.
It is not hatred to stand up for values that have been the bedrock of your family for generations.
The counter-protesters try to drown out her speech as well.
Then Lisa Robinson references a broader debate that helped to spark the 1 Million March in 2023, pronoun disclosure. This debate is about whether schools are required to disclose a student's pronouns to their parents. Mandatory pronoun disclosure in schools would mean that if a student uses he at home but wants to be known as she or they at school, then schools would have to inform the student's parents in certain circumstances.
We refuse to accept a system that tells children to keep secrets from their parents, that pushes confusing and divisive ideologies without the full involvement of their families.
That argument, which eventually spread across Canada, started when New Brunswick's progressive conservative government changed provincial policy in 2023. The changes required students under 16 to get parental consent if they wanted to use their preferred name and pronouns at school.
New Brunswick has since elected a new Liberal government, replacing the Progressive Conservatives. The New Brunswick Liberals lowered the age that schools must respect students' preferred name and pronouns to grade 6.
Back at the protest, the next speaker, Hatem Kir, is introduced as a constitutional lawyer.
The Constitution protects the rights of parents to parent their children.
Hatem also had to compete with counter-protesters trying to drown him out.
Under Section 2A, we all have the right to freedom of religion. The Supreme Court has said that liberty means the rights of...
It's hard to make out over the counter-protesters, but Hatem goes on to say that parents have the right to determine the moral upbringing of their children and to make the most important decisions for their children as it relates to education and medical care. But speaking with other lawyers for the show has suggested that what Hatem Kir is saying here is arguable.
When it comes to the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on rights in conflict, their stated view has always been that these rights are all equal, that none takes priority over the others.
That's Marcus McCann.
I'm a human rights lawyer and the author of a book about park cruising.
Marcus argues that parental rights have to be properly balanced with the rights of children. It's a view echoed by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And so what Hatem Kir is arguing, that parents have the right to determine the moral upbringing of their children, is not the whole story.
It's a whole other vein of jurisprudence about the rights of young people to autonomy in their decision-making, including medical decision-making.
So yes, it's true that parents have freedom of religion, and parents have the right to uphold that when they raise their children. But Marcus McCann argues that freedom of religion needs to be balanced with the rights of young people. In Canada, there is legal precedent that would indicate a child's rights and well-being should be prioritized.
This got us wondering, what rights specifically are being infringed upon when a student's pronouns are disclosed without their consent? At first, we thought it could be Section 8 of the Constitution, the right to privacy.
Marcus McCann, though, isn't convinced it is children's right to privacy that is most at risk here.
I think the main concern there isn't privacy as much as safety.
Canadians' right to security, and by extension their safety, is protected by Section 7 of the Charter.
And if a young person has decided it's not safe to come out at home, there's usually a good reason for it. A blanket requirement that a school board disclose that information to parents is setting up young people for hardships. We don't have to do that.
In fact, setting young people up for hardships arguably contradicts another legal obligation that Canada has. As a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Canada committed to considering the best interests of the child in legal disputes. This could mean that a parent's freedom of religion doesn't necessarily supersede the rights of their queer or trans child.
All right. Basically what we've learned is parents can exercise their religious rights in order to parent their children. But children have their own rights as well. And like we've seen with the pronoun disclosure debate, sometimes those rights appear to come into conflict.
And Ontario actually has a framework on how to navigate conflicting rights.
Raj Anand is my name. He or him or il or lui.
Raj Anand is the former chief commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission.
I was a full-time commissioner and there were part-time commissioners as well who made decisions on individual cases and who approved commission policies.
The Ontario Human Rights Commission has guiding principles for how courts should evaluate human rights in conflict. These principles include 1. No rights are absolute. 2. There is no hierarchy of human rights. 3. Rights may not extend as far as claimed. And 4. The full context of the dispute, the competing rights, must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Courts must evaluate the legal stakes and people's lived realities. Raj Anand explains one way that courts can balance rights that appear to be in conflict.
One has to look at how you can maximize the rights and freedoms of both sides. And so our human rights laws involve concepts of reasonable accommodation. And what those mean essentially is that a rule or a policy or a requirement can be adjusted, relaxed, modified so as to, as I say, maximize the enjoyment of rights by one or more parties.
Some parental rights advocates claim that they are entitled to know the pronouns that their child is using at school and how their child identifies at school. On the other side, some school administrators and 2S LGBTQ+ advocacy groups fear that outing students to their families could cause harm. From a legal standpoint, what do you think is going to be necessary here to balance the concerns of both sides?
I think this is an example of where one looks at the relative disadvantage of the two sides, if I can call it that. Parents, as a general proposition, in terms of knowing what their children are doing and what their activities are and how they identify themselves, is important. But the lives and health of those who are already in a situation in which they have to hide from the world is more important.
Marcus McCann challenges the notion that the rights of 2S LGBTQ+ children infringe on a parent's freedom of religion. We asked him why.
Well, because no one has identified a firmly held religious belief to be nasty to queer and trans people.
As in, there's no firmly held religious belief that parents should put queer and trans youth in harm's way because of their gender identity or sexual orientation.
If somebody has a religious belief that being in a gay relationship is wrong, they don't have to get into a gay relationship. No one is forcing anyone to engage in things that are against their beliefs. They're not required to participate in gay life. What they are required to do is respect the rights of others to their full participation in this case, education.
When it comes to full participation in education, the issue of student pronoun disclosure is only one part of the story. Some parental rights advocates say it infringes on their religious freedom to teach about gender identity and sexual orientation to their kids in public education. Here's human rights lawyer Marcus McCann on that.
When it comes to teaching about different kinds of families or inclusivity, I don't think that's actually an infringement of a religious right. That is describing the world.
Debbie Owusu-Acha is the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. Debbie has advocated for queer and trans inclusion in public curriculum throughout her career. That said, she empathizes with parents who have concerns about sexual education.
It's totally understandable for parents and for guardians and for the caretakers of young students to really be curious about what their youth are learning and wanting to make sure that they fully understand what's being taught in schools.
Debbie says that inclusive sex ed doesn't just help queer and trans people, it helps school communities more broadly.
According to the research, if folks are learned from a young age about empathy, and that really is one of the key tools that's being taught in sexual health, is understanding yourself and understanding each other, that has huge benefits, not only for school communities, but the broader Canadian society as a whole. And that is really what's key and important for parents to understand. But also another thing that I emphasize that it's super important for institutions to bring parents and to bring adults along with the journey as well as the youth. So everybody's understanding what is really being taught and what's being understood. And that's building and teaching empathy.
So at the 1 Million March for Children, we heard opposition to sex ed. We also heard from parents who believe they have the right to know how their child identifies, no matter what.
We also heard from parents who strongly oppose gender-affirming care for minors, period. But not all parents agree. Family doctor Kate Greenaway says in many cases, parents of gender-diverse children are actually helping their kids access gender-affirming care.
During medical school, I knew I wanted to focus on LGBTQ health specifically.
Dr. Greenaway has a private practice for gender-affirming care in Ontario and Alberta.
I will say that I meet a lot of supportive parents. You know, it's been an interesting time in Alberta when we've had some proposed policies put forward to ban gender-affirming care for adolescents, where the parents are so vocal about how damaging this is for their families and for their kids.
And those proposed policies became law in December of 2024, meaning some big changes at school.
Danielle Smith's Alberta government passed what some are calling the most restrictive anti-trans laws in Canada. Laws that include limiting access to medical gender-affirming care for minors. The new laws also require children under 16 to have parental consent in order to change their name or pronouns at school.
These laws also impact sex ed curriculum, requiring parents to opt in before their children can learn about gender identity and sexual orientation. But Dr. Greenaway says that not all parents think Alberta's new legislation helps kids.
We've seen parents come forward in a different way saying, this is not what I want. You know, if the rhetoric is that this is to protect families and to protect parents, like, it's not working, because what we want is for our children to be healthy and happy, and you're not allowing us that option.
Dr. Greenaway insists that Alberta's politics around gender-affirming care are contrary to medical consensus.
Like, it's this strange moment where there's not really dissent in the medical literature about whether gender-affirming care works in the sense of, like, improves people's lives and well-being, right? It's a challenging moment when we're getting a lot of very well-funded political rhetoric that is anti-trans in nature. And we're seeing it happen in the U.S., obviously, in a much deeper, terrifying way.
There are some places your boy leaves the school, comes back a girl, without parental consent. What is that all about?
U.S. President-elect Donald Trump ran on a campaign heavy with anti-2S LGBTQ+ rhetoric in 2024. In the face of misinformation like this, Dr. Greenaway emphasized two things about gender-affirming care in Ontario. One, the threshold to qualify for gender-affirming care is not based on the age of the patient. It's based on something doctors call capacity.
In Ontario, there isn't a medical age of majority. So the way it works is each medical intervention, no matter what, we're talking about gender-affirming care, we're talking about mental health treatment, whatever it is the adolescent is coming to see me for, my job in that scenario is to assess what their ability to consent to that conversation and to that medical intervention. Capacity is what we call that.
And two,
there is no medical intervention for youth prior to puberty.
And for those who are concerned that gender-affirming care is too easily available, Dr. Greenaway had this to say.
I'm sorry, how many times did you have to go to the doctor for your knee pain before you were referred to a surgeon? Like, why do you have to be put through a different system than the person beside you to seek medical care?
Once speeches at the 1 Million March wrapped up, we sat down with one of the key organizers, Kareem Tadros. It's worth noting that after the speeches, the march never actually got underway. Not enough people showed up this year.
How did you feel today went?
Well, today the turnout wasn't what we expected. It's been a tough year for Canadians. There's been a lot of political dynamics happening, but we did see the parents who know what this is about and know what to expect. Just wanted another shot at coming out and having their voices heard, and maybe meeting like-minded parents.
I wanted to get Kareem's reaction to one of the counter-protester speeches. One of them said that their trans identity was denied by their parents, and that was deeply challenging for them. I asked Kareem whether he was worried about the effect the 1 Million March could have on folks grappling with their identity.
Well, you know, there's a bigger conversation to have, and the problem with the counter-protesters is we can never get far enough into the conversation. The exception doesn't deny the rule. So we know for sure there are cases where trans kids need help, need attention, need the therapy that's needed. Listen, everybody deserves to live with dignity, a sense of emotional security, and a true sense of identity and self. The problem is, you cannot diagnose that in a classroom setting. Teachers are not qualified as child therapists to be having those conversations.
We asked the Ministry of Education whether students were, in fact, being diagnosed in classroom settings as trans or gender nonconforming. The ministry responded via email saying, the Ministry of Education expects schools to ensure that every student, regardless of their sexual orientation, race, or faith, feels empowered to achieve their full potential and prioritize teaching students foundational life and job skills in the classroom.
Is in some cases, there is significant concern that if a child's pronouns are disclosed at home, it will lead to disownment or violence or mental health adverse effects on that child. In such cases, do you still advocate for this policy across the board of pronoun disclosure?
It is a complex issue for sure, and cases like that absolutely must exist. But at what point do we give children the ability to make decisions without parental intervention, or to know that the child is making an informed decision?
As we've heard from Dr. Greenaway, there's no medical age of majority that confirms a child's ability to make decisions about gender-affirming care. The ability to choose treatment depends on what doctors call capacity.
In fact, even the conversation of sexuality, why is it even being had in a classroom?
And as we've heard from Debbie Owusu-Acha at Action Canada, studies have shown including queer and trans people in curriculum helps to foster equity in school communities.
As we were wrapping up to leave the 1 Million March, there was one last thing that was gnawing at me. I wanted to get Kareem's thoughts about how far-right groups were amplifying his movement's message. So Campaign Life Coalition, are you aware of this group? They take a really strong anti-trans stance. They're a Christian organization. Do you align with their values? Do you feel comfortable being linked with them? They were promoting this event on their website.
So I believe Million March has been promoted by many groups. I don't work directly with them, nor am I familiar with the extreme of the messaging you're talking about. But no matter what my personal opinion is, if we can't lay down the rules where they're fair for everybody and we can all coexist in a way that we feel none of our rights are being infringed on, then we still have to continue exploring the solution. And we're not there yet.
Tiff?
Matt?
So, do you think it's possible to get where Kareem is talking about there? A place where we can lay down rules that are fair to everybody, where all the interested parties feel their rights are being protected.
Well, I wonder if the case of Trustee Mike Del Grande from episodes 1 and 2 might be instructive here.
In what way?
Well, about the pitfalls of refusing to accommodate the competing rights of others. We saw in Trustee Del Grande's case that he arguably dug his heels in and insisted that his freedom of religion and freedom of speech were inalienable. And so far, that approach is not working out for him.
Quick refresher, in 2019, Trustee Del Grande used what some call inflammatory language to argue that Toronto Catholic should deny additional protections for queer and trans people in their school code of conduct. In the end, the Toronto Catholic Board of Trustees voted to sanction Del Grande for his remarks. And in return, Del Grande took Toronto Catholic to court to challenge that decision. Ultimately, the Ontario Court of Appeal sided with Toronto Catholic in this case. However, the matter may remain in the courts, and so the board's sanctions have not been applied.
Notably, the court said, in part, that Del Grande's freedom of religion didn't justify his use of extreme and derogatory rhetoric.
The Toronto Catholic District School Board had an update on Trustee Del Grande's case at the December 12, 2024 board meeting. Here's Chair of the Board, Trustee Marcus DiDomenico, speaking at that meeting.
One of this board's fundamental values is that all students and members of our community have inherent dignity and worth and must be treated as such. Trustee Del Grande, you breached these values. For this conduct, we censure you.
At that same meeting, Trustee Del Grande offered thoughts of his own on the board's decision.
I am in my 6th year of wrath of organized hate against me. It is not enough to walk with Jesus. His preaching tells me to be not afraid. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I believe him.
We asked Trustee Del Grande's lawyer, Charles Lugosi, about his client's next steps.
There are strong grounds to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. Whether we in fact do so or not will be decided by Mr. Del Grande. The decision may rest on his health, it may rest on his resources, and so on. But from a legal perspective, I think that there is a need for the Supreme Court to clarify the law in this area. It seems to me that the Court of Appeal did not believe that the issues raised in the Del Grande case were of general application, of central importance to the legal system as a whole. I believe they are.
The prospect of a possible Supreme Court battle has galvanized Mike Del Grande's supporters at Campaign Life Coalition. And in the span of about a month, Campaign Life Coalition has already raised more than $50,000 for Mike Del Grande's legal defense. That's on top of the $250,000 they've already raised for proceedings in the lower courts. CLC asked if Mike Del Grande would bring his fight to the Supreme Court of Canada, and Del Grande had this message for his supporters. If I know that I've got a supportive team behind me, I'm willing to go all the way.
That said, we've seen throughout our reporting that efforts are being made at Toronto Catholic to balance competing rights. For example, Toronto Catholic's Equity Department. I think some of their work upholds the notion of reasonable accommodation. They're working to develop Catholic school curriculum that better reflects the Ministry of Education's 2S LGBTQ+ inclusive policies, while being mindful of the tenets of Catholicism.
Yeah, and if I've learned anything in this episode, the justice system we've got aims to maximize rights for parties in conflict, and that means acknowledging that sometimes compromises are needed. So it would appear we can only move forward if both parties agree to accommodate each other, to accept each other's differences, and come to the table in good faith.
Queries in Good Faith is hosted and written by me, Tiff Lam.
And me, Matt Nethersole.
Sound design and editing by me, Tiff Lam.
Our associate producer is Leticia Dogbay.
Editing and technical support from Matthew O'Mara.
Special thanks to Marina Black and everyone who shared their stories and expertise for this show.
Even if you're not in it, you helped us make sense of it, so thank you.
For TVO, Katie O'Connor is the managing editor of podcasts and digital video.
Lori Few is the executive producer of digital.
John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Theme music by Allison Leighton Brown.
Thanks for listening.